Hello. Oh, I need to say in the Discord that I'm going live. Normally, I try to do this on my desktop. For some reason, the Discord on my desktop is like has the hardest time loading these days. Okay, doing that. I'll also go into Instagram. I'm so averse to social media that I immediately feel like I immediately feel my stress levels increase. Okay, that's on Instagram. Ugh. Even just like going into these platforms, I know they're built to like give people a rush of dopamine, but it like sends cortisol straight through my body. Okay. I neglected to do this yesterday because my phone died, and by the time it had loaded, like rebooted, got power back on, I was just like, I can't be bothered. It's maybe not the best attitude, but also, uh, especially these days, just with everything in life, I'm not always able to be streaming around the same time. So, like, one of the best ways to actually know when I'm going live is to have the notifications turned on Twitch, which I realize is another type of social media platform and type of notification that people are receiving. And we're just bombarded constantly with our attention being split everywhere. So I also recognize that. Do what you need to do, but that is the most reliable, especially if I forget to send a message about going live. So there you go. Another day, another stream in fascist America. The United States, that is. Welcome to whatever this is, an attempt at providing education, advocacy, and a little common sense in this digital wasteland. I'm Aubri Devashrayee. Today we're going to continue talking about the history of swine, the history of policing around the world, but I'll relate it back to how it is happening in the US, and that there are many techniques that are just, well, I guess the whole idea of a modern policing system and police state is deeply colonized, and how there are these colonial tactics that have been used for warfare now, and it is largely used to inflict violence and human suffering on nations outside of the US empire. Um, and how this type of colonial policing and violence is happening currently with all of these genocides going on. It's not an accident that many police forces in the US train with the IDF, that the US sends the most amount of weapons to the IDF, and that it's not just the US, but many police forces around the world train with the IDF, and how incredibly just like problematic doesn't even cover it, just like nefarious and evil the whole practice is. So we need to be talking about that, and how these types of very violent enforcement are directly linked to colonial extraction and expansion, these projects that are based off of one population of people viewing themselves as being superior, and then to justify their delusional sense of superiority, to create these hierarchies of human dignity and say, like, that's naturally how this is, and certain people have to be oppressed and suppressed in violent ways in order to maintain this violent system. So I just went about in circles there, repeating a lot, but you get what I mean. Anyway, I did a lot of chatting yesterday, gabbing away, which I do enjoy, but I did want to get to more of the content that we have. Zechap, fellow streamer, also recommended this video that we started watching. We didn't get super far into it just as we were talking about various things, but I want to get more into that, especially with talking about IQ, this IQ test that people have come to determine what means intelligence from, this like arbitrary, very discriminatory test that was used to justify the oppression and exclusion of Black and brown people, but especially Black people, Indigenous people, and how this just goes to show as well who is viewed as able-bodied and who has a disability, that all of this is extremely arbitrary, and that all of this really has to go back to class and, once again, colonization, and justifying both of these things that are just interwoven together. And it's not an accident that the fascists that are out and proud now, not the kind of pride we need during Pride Month, but that they often are like, that's a low IQ thing. That's like, okay, of course we would be expecting you to say this kind of bullshit that is incredibly discriminatory. So I want to get into the history there, because often people, I think, can say like, oh, that's low IQ, that's dumb. That it's like a lot of this is very ableist language, and ableism is based off of white supremacy and eugenics, and once again, colonial oppression, violence, extraction, all of these things. I'm one of these people that's like, well, you know, a lot of things are connected. It just kind of goes back to human nature, and, which I'm not very optimistic about. And how there are many people that just want to justify their own unearned positions in society, the ruling class, by inflicting pain on everyone else and dehumanizing other people through these various practices, like over policing, or just policing in general, living in a police state, in how so many neighborhoods and people have been under occupation by police for since the beginning of what is known as the United States of America, the colonies. Guess what? A colony is part of a colonial enterprise. So we have to talk about all of these things. They're very connected. And then, since we finished the address to the Central Committee of the Communist League, which is part of my edition of the Communist Manifesto, I did want to get into Othello, because frequent viewer, chatter, mod, subscriber, Tan, lovely human, requested this play to be read, and I think it's great. Especially, I'm a Shakespeare nerd, but also Othello is rife with opportunity for decolonizing the text, and I am excited to call this shit out, because as someone who enjoys Shakespeare, I think you can enjoy it even more when we engage critically with what all of this means, and how we can actually have a fuller story when we are offering more people humanity. Imagine that. Okay, so let's get into things. Per usual, we'll start with a humorous video. This is by The Onion. Tesla launches new model of explosions, and I love this. The description says, Tesla stocks are surging following Elon Musk's announcement that the fully self-combusting Tesla XP is set to debut later this month. Just calling out how there are all of these issues with really all of these enterprises that Elon Musk has embarked upon that he has not done any work for because he's part of the ruling class and by nature does not work for income. So he isn't working for anything. He's not creating anything. Other people are doing this for him. But I love how people are calling this out, especially when it comes to him being part of the like Doge stupidity and harm that he was in charge of and caused, that they stripped all of these regulations and all of these oversight bodies so that they can continue all of the very harmful products that they are creating. So love this call out. Okay.
Tesla stocks are surging this morning after the company finally announced its long-awaited next-generation model of explosions. According to CEO Elon Musk, the premium high-performance exploding Tesla Series XP is set to debut later this month. For more, we're joined now from the New York Stock Exchange by ONN Stephen Green. Stephen, how much of a role is this announcement playing in what we're seeing in the stock?
It's certainly having a positive effect, Dwight. And look, it's no secret that Tesla's been underperforming. Not nearly as many fiery infernos in Q1 as they would have hoped, but they think that they have something here with this new model.
It does look slick, but what is it that makes this Tesla different from their other fireballs on the market?
Well, like its predecessors, the XP features Tesla's signature minimalist interiors with functional touchscreens, futuristic curves, and...
Wait, we have to pause. Also, the attention to detail with the onion, we already know, is very thorough. I love this. But look at this other headline. Top news. Former This Is Us star alleges show was scripted. When the show is scripted. New Tesla to rival Toyota's brakeless Prius. What? The competition. It's heating up. Quite literally. Explosive even. LCD touch screen trigger. TNT front and trunk. Fuse. Just fuse. Firestorm igniter. Malfunctioning locks. Okay, that's a detail I wasn't expecting. Impressive. Undercarriage gunpowder chamber.
leather seats that will all immediately combust and disintegrate upon ignition. But what's different about the XP is that they've actually borrowed some of the same technology used by SpaceX, incorporating it as well as a whole slew of other safety features that are basically non-existent.
And any concern from Tesla about potentially shrinking its customer base?
Not according to Musk, who spoke at a launch event yesterday saying of Tesla drivers, quote, "Not even death can stop these idiots from giving us their money."
Might have to get over to the dealership and test explode one of those myself. All right, thank you, Steve. Coming up next, a major archaeological discovery. Hear how a recent excavation may have uncovered the source of the annoying ancient beeping sound. You're watching the...
I love that. Wait, I have to go back. Look, world's 4 remaining Christians to be extinct. Jesus.
Of the annoying ancient beeping sound.
But Jesus.
You're watching the Onion
apparently.
News Network, the only cable news network that watches back.
I mean, sadly, it's not the only one that watches back. Oh, this is interesting. I don't know if that's a glitch on my end, but how that just kept going. Okay, so let's get back to talking about the pigs. I said this yesterday and have been saying this, but like, it is offensive to pigs to be calling them that. Pigs are much more intelligent. Pigs actually have a sense of care for their fellow species. So this is why we have to just call them like selfish, cruel, evil people. Stuart Little. It's all computer. Tesla. Stuart Little is my son. We were talking about this the other day of like Elon being the first trillionaire, and I'll tie this into how IQ test is eugenics and all of these like Darwinistic uh, fitness tests, which is really just white supremacy and colonization, how it's like it should be considered a mental illness to be hoarding this much wealth. Of like, since mental illness seems to be so arbitrary and classist and racist, and how that is not enforced across class lines very clearly, of like you gave the example of like if there was like a monkey in nature that was hoarding all of the food, like trillions of bananas or whatever they eat, that like the monkeys would all be like, yeah, this one has to go. This one clearly is not okay and has evil plans that is hurting the rest of us. This is unacceptable. This is also why I think like consciousness has kind of just like fucked us over, because yeah, going against instinct and all of this, but how that is not viewed as being like, oh, you have like issues you need to resolve, that like you're causing all of this death and destruction, and it is all to support your fragile little ego. How you're like, it's such ugly loser behavior. So this is why they feel the need to brainwash people, and they have to like buy people's affection, and they will never really know what it means to actually have genuine support and care because they don't care about other people. So anyway, I thought that was a really good point, and want to tie that into how we view mental illness and how it is not always applied evenly across class and race and sexuality and gender identity, all of these things. Okay, so this is where we left off. We were talking about how there were various types of policing throughout human history. Of course, this is not, I mean, this is far more comprehensive than anything else I've seen. I think Zach does a really great job of getting a wide variety of people and content to be pulling from and learning from. Yeah, I really like this Basquiat video. On police, that's often what people in the upper classes, they want to like revere Basquiat, but don't realize how like how much of a contrarian he was, and how much he like called out cops, and then he was essentially absorbed into the capitalist class, and his art was very much co-opted and defanged with its very biting, important social commentary, where that part was minimized in order for capitalists to benefit from his art and existence while not offering him humanity, and ignoring some of the most important aspects of his art. So there we go. Okay. So this is more of the techniques of the pigs and what they have done throughout history. So we have gotten to this part of Nazi Germany, and this is a photo of the Gestapo staging a photo where they are doing a mock execution of a communist. Does it seem like there is a whole lot that has changed, or even more so, that modern forces are feeling empowered to be doing this kind of shit out in the open? We need to call this out. Oh, I should probably refresh this because it's going to do that, like, content not found. That happens when I have videos up for a couple of days. Okay, 2403. It doesn't always save where I'm at.
Military groups to fight against labor organizations,
there we go.
all of which resulted in the massacre of 19 civilians who took part in the International Workers' Day demonstration. None of this is surprising, of course, because only a few years later, the German police would become an enthusiastic part of Nazi Germany's system of oppression, which allowed them more powers than they previously had and encouraged violence against communists, Jews, Romani people, and other opponents of Nazi rule. To make the police seem as if they were honorable keepers of the peace,
Central
the Nazis
Committee.
printed propaganda posters depicting the police teaching children, helping people cross the road, and just generally making them seem like nice, normal people. Now, we don't see this scale of violence against workers in the US and other first world countries today,
So
but that's
funny.
mostly because for a very long time, the rights of workers did get a bit better. People had less of a reason to strike, but it is only because the striking workers were eventually.
Yeah, so this is the part where they're talking about how policing also has been disproportionately enforced with unionizing, striking, that there are these systemic ways, like bureaucratic ways to suppress and oppress workers, especially when it comes to organizing their workplaces and having collective bargaining power. But also, there is this element of enforcement through law enforcement that is done violently to also suppress any sort of movement when it comes to fighting for workers' rights and more dignity in the workplace.
Successful, that there is an established 8-hour workday and a minimum wage in the US now. And the entire time those people fought for labor rights, the rights that you are profiting from, the police were there to beat and to kill them. The situation of workers in the United States, Britain, and Germany, among many other first world nations, is slowly declining. So you can expect to see more union building and labor organizations continuing the tradition of fighting for better living conditions in the near future. And you can expect the police to be sent there to beat them and kill them the same way they did 100 years ago. Third world nations, and even allies of the West outside of Western Europe, however, have not been so lucky. Unlike the people living in the first world countries, workers of these other countries,
3 of those cowards to be going after one woman who is unarmed, it looked like. It's a cat. Okay, gotcha. Okay, so this is Peru. Peruvian resistance, especially when it comes to workers organizing, has always been led by indigenous people. And this is happening now in fighting for workers' rights, fighting against these fuel shortages and how that is impacting workers. So this continues.
Are still facing repression by the police when trying to demand better working conditions, the same ones that we are used to in the West, and they are getting killed just the same. In 2009, at the Sangyong Motor Factory in South Korea, almost half of the workforce was laid off without warning after the company decided to sell. These workers staged a protest at the factory, which resulted in the violent repression of protesters, including the use of tear gas fired from helicopters and water cannons. By the end of the protest, the police had blockaded the factory and prevented the strikers from receiving water, food, and electricity. More than 100 strikers.
What many people who don't realize that are like, oh, don't aggravate the cops, like don't do anything that could make them angry. It's like they do this shit anyway. They do this shit when no one is doing anything that they are viewing as like threatening, whatever. It's like, so what do we have to lose then? That we just have to continually be brutalized by these people, by these I like am running out of like adjectives and like descriptive words for like how much I hate cops. Ugh, but yeah, like so they're doing this shit anyway when you're doing everything supposedly by the book when it comes to abiding by these systems and what is like the right way, quote unquote, right way to be protesting. So like what then where does that leave us? So if they're going to be doing the same thing to us, no matter what happens, we might as well actually be protecting ourselves. That's my take.
Were arrested, some of them sent to jail for years, but the government continued to make an example of them. Striking workers were blacklisted from working at other large South Korean companies. In addition, the police collaborated with the government to sue protesters in civil court, resulting in equal to $9 million in fines. When the workers obviously could not pay this amount, they had their personal assets, meaning their homes and their cars, seized. These people were basically made homeless and unable to find work at another motor company within their country for staging a protest. The most recent case I found of this happening, though, is in January of 2025, where the South African police killed 87 protesting miners, although I'm sure in the process of writing and editing this video, it has likely happened again. All of this is because the police exist to protect the state, to protect private property, to keep labor from organizing, and to enforce the laws that keep society running.
Yep.
Much like in the British Empire, the United States had realized repressing labor movements looked a lot better when it wasn't done by the military. Besides disrupting labor movements, there are many other ways that the police enforce the laws of society while directly participating in the harming of the working class. For example, much like the need to keep labor organizing disrupted, another necessity of the capitalist system of the United States is that there is no public housing system, meaning that people either need to buy a home, something that is becoming increasingly difficult unless you are wealthy. As wages stagnate and as rent prices continue to increase, many people who were already struggling are faced with eviction. After COVID, for example, rent prices increased drastically and the rate of evictions filed grew by more than 50%, resulting in 3.5 million evictions filed in a single year. In 2016, 7 evictions were filed every minute. Now, the landlord doesn't care about you. They will try to make as much money as they can off of their property, even if they know that the person living in the apartment cannot afford it. Once a person becomes unable to pay, they file for an eviction to kick you out and replace you with someone they can make more money off of. Sometimes the people getting evicted leave freely. Maybe they found a different, cheaper apartment. Maybe they have family and friends to live with. But unfortunately for thousands of people, they have nothing else they can do and refuse to leave. This is where the state comes in. Obviously, your landlord, who doesn't even bother to fix your broken appliances or throw up a fresh coat of paint for a new tenant, isn't going to do anything himself. And he doesn't have to. As a person who owns private property, the police will step in to enforce the law for them. As expected, when you are trying to forcefully throw someone and everything they own onto the street, some people will choose to resist. This violence is exacerbated by the fact that many people who cannot afford their apartments are people suffering from either a mental or physical illness. There are no federal statistics on the rate of violent evictions, but an independent group has founded evictionlab.org to track evictions across the United States. At moment of recording, the group only tracks evictions in 10 US states. But even in those 10
Landlords are
states, the
bastards
data
too.
coming
Yeah,
out is hard to
exactly.
believe, with
A
over
lab. Yeah,
55,000 people
ACAB,
being
A
forced to
lab.
leave their homes in the last month, and over 40 people dying
I think
while being
ACAB
evicted
could
in
also be all
2023. Keep in mind,
capitalists.
that's only people who
Are
died and not people who were
bastards.
beaten or shot and survived. Now, you may be listening to this and think to yourself, now hold on, that person who can't pay rent, they don't have the right to stay in this other person's property, and when they don't leave by choice, it's their own fault what the police do to them. So I want to step back and take a look at the actual people involved in the situation. People need somewhere to live. When a person can't pay rent, it isn't just because of some personal failing of theirs. People get sick or disabled and become unable to work. Rent prices are increased and their wages stay the same, or they could just get fired and not find another job. Regardless, homelessness will not help people who are already in a financially desperate situation. Now, discussing the ethics of owning a home that you rent out and living off of another person's labor in exchange for something that they absolutely need to.
Yeah, so them talking about how people who are disabled are disproportionately evicted. This is true, especially when they're like this is also true of people of color, especially black people, queer people, especially trans people, gender expansive people, um, immigrants in general, but especially as we have these intersections of marginalization, people are more likely to be evicted and also to not be paid as much. So we see how all of these systems work hand in hand to disempower people, dehumanize people, and then justify their dehumanization through these violent means. And how, like, that is what marginalization is. That is a very violent system in saying that there are some people who actually deserve to live, who actually deserve to have a chance at existing in society openly as they are, and actually be paid for any sort of work that they do. And it justifies these other racist, discriminatory systems that are intentionally upholding the capitalist class. But like I've said before, getting rid of capitalism is not just like the only solution to solving discrimination. It upholds many forms of discrimination, but we cannot just say that, like, if capitalism is gone, that there won't be other kinds of discrimination that have been internalized and won't be used to have people co-opt power and have their own nefarious means for getting into positions of power. That it's like we have seen many types of discrimination undermine leftist movements, leftist governments, and that this is something that we have to call out, that like these things exist outside of capitalism but are perpetuated and are ingratiated within capitalism.
Is its own separate video. But that is the system that the USA and other European countries have. As soon as you, as a tenant, are not profitable to your landlord, you will be thrown out, regardless of the fact that it may not be your fault that you can no longer afford rent, and that being thrown out onto the street might destroy your life. Just like the police step in to disrupt a labor organization to maintain the profit that the business owner makes, the police step in to enforce evictions and to maintain the profit that a landlord makes. Imagine how much easier it would be, for example, for workers to organize and demand better working conditions, and for tenants to organize into tenant unions and demand better living conditions and lower rents if the implicit threat of police violence wasn't there. Like I said in the beginning, the police exist as the arm of the state that protects them from domestic threats, including domestic threats to profit. And as a person watching this video who is most likely a worker who is not a landlord, you should want better and fairer working and living conditions, not just for yourself, but for your neighbors and the people that haven't been as fortunate in life. The harassment doesn't just stop at eviction, however, as many homeless people also frequently interact with.
Yep. Cops kick out homeless person and the person who bought him food from McDonald's. Yeah. So, like, the answer is, like, to these people, the capitalist class, the ruling class, people who are enforcing it, it is not about, like, people doing things a right or wrong way, which is why we have to constantly be questioning and redefining what crime means, what it means to be quote unquote criminal. Because in my mind, the fact that there is a human being that is allowed to have $1 trillion, that's criminal. If it is at the expense of other human beings, that should be a crime. But why we constantly have to question these laws, and that, like, is it a crime to be violating or to be going against resisting these laws that are inherently anti-human? But how it's like, even when you are evicted, you are not in a job, that, like, it's not enough to just be existing outside of that. The answer to the capitalist class is for you to not exist at all, or to be put in prisons for, and this modern slavery system in order to make a cheap profit. It's like, this is the whole aspect of the for-profit industrial complex of marginalizing people so much that there are no options for them left when they are actually able to be in society, and what's left is to be criminalizing their existence so that they are unseen and completely dehumanized for pure free labor. I guess I shouldn't say pure, but, like, in that, the mindset of saying, like, this is how they view labor, of, like, that is, like, the best type of labor for the system.
Officers. Interactions between homeless people and police officers are more likely to become violent, even fatal, than interactions between the police and housed people. This is exacerbated, of course, by the fact that governments often refuse to grapple with the policy failure that has resulted in homelessness within their community. It isn't profitable to provide public housing and fund systems that can help homeless people with the problems they face, and even though the research shows that this would help the lives of homeless people, governments have chosen to respond by using the police. In 2024, the Supreme Court of the United States ruled that cities can punish homeless people for sleeping in public spaces, even in cities where there is a lack of affordable housing or homeless shelters. Punishment can range from fining homeless people up to $1,000 for sleeping in public spaces to jailing them. And to recap, that is the state which has implemented policies that increase the rate of homelessness, sending the police to enforce these laws, which fine and jail people that are already suffering from poverty. And then, of course, are the racist prejudices within the policing system itself, a core ingredient of how the cake of modern-day policing was baked. We all know the statistics about racist police violence. We've seen the hundreds of videos of black and brown people being killed by the police without cause. We know that black people are 3 times more likely to be killed by police officers than white people, and 4 times more likely to actually be convicted of the same crime. What's worse is that instead of being held to the same laws, police are often protected from prosecution, as only 1% of police officers involved in killing a civilian is ever charged. That means actual convictions for murder are much lower than 1%. Another relevant but often ignored part of this is the rate of police violence against Native Americans. Black Americans and Native Americans are constantly switching between the number 1 and number 2 spots of most common victims of police violence. It is not a coincidence that these two communities have some of the highest rates of poverty and substance abuse in the US.
Yeah, that is marginalization, because of criminalizing people and forcing people to be in these circumstances that are anti-human. Also, the fact that there is a movement called Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women, where there are so many Indigenous women, and that's what this means: missing, murdered Indigenous women, no more stolen sisters, that, like, being disproportionately attacked, like, quite literally preyed upon, that cannot be separated from this larger system of violence.
Stories of violence against Black Americans managed to get brought to light through American media because the Black community in the US is much larger than the Native American community, and therefore much harder to ignore. We know the cases of the racist murders of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and Eric Garner. But I bet you haven't heard about Jacqueline Sawyers, a 32-year-old pregnant woman who was shot to death in her car because her passenger had an outstanding warrant. The murder was ruled justified because the police officer who killed her said she had threatened him with her car, and despite every single other witness who was there saying this never happened, the judge ignored the testimonies and let her killer walk free. Or 35-year-old Paul Castaway, a man who suffered from schizophrenia and threatened to kill himself with a knife, who never approached the police but was shot dead anyway. Or Corey Kanosh, a 35-year-old man who was shot after being pulled over by the police, who didn't call for emergency services until 30 minutes after shooting him, and then actively prevented the emergency services from being able to help him, causing him to continue bleeding out and eventually dying. The United States has the highest rate of fatal police encounters in the world by far, where more than 1,000 people are killed every year. Now, I'm not saying that police officers get together every morning to scheme about how they are going to kill black and indigenous people. Well, at least not every police officer. It isn't because every single officer is a racist or because most police officers are white. What I'm saying is that the police are part of a system that institutionally disadvantages and targets black and other minority groups. This used to be more explicit, like the repression of black voting rights and Jim Crow laws, but has now shifted to a version that can appear on the surface level as unproblematic. For example, how most black communities were formed by old racist laws that grouped black people together in one place away from white homeowners, and how these neighborhoods are overwhelmingly poorer, having less opportunities for a good education, have a lower rate of homeownership, and have less access to healthy food. All of these can affect someone's ability to get a job, something that is also highly racialized, as studies have shown that black people with black-sounding names are less likely to be called back for a job interview than a white person with the same qualifications. Not only does this affect the amount of crime in these neighborhoods, but the more common anti-black bias in the United States leads to black people more likely to be arrested and more likely to serve longer sentences than white people for the same crime. Then, of course, there's the fact that predominantly black and Latino neighborhoods are more likely to be targeted by the police, which, of course, will lead to more interactions with them. A study about anti-black bias in police officers found that officers exhibit consistently higher levels of bias than members of the public overall and compared to other members of their own racial groups, and that black police displayed a higher explicitly pro-white or anti-black bias. This can be shown in many examples of murders by black police officers, the most well-known of which is probably the case of Tyree Nichols, a 29-year-old black man who was pulled over for reckless driving, was tased, and then tried to run to his mother's house, where he was caught by 5 black police officers who proceeded to beat him to death in the street. This isn't anything new though. The 1991 film Boys in the Hood, written and made by mostly black people about their experiences growing up in a low-income, mostly black neighborhood, includes a scene where 2 young black men are randomly pulled over, searched, and harassed by a black police officer who appears just as, if not more sadistic, than his white partner.
Huh. Scared now. I like that. That's why I took this job.
Even without studying statistics and institutional racism, for decades,
Yeah, as we were just talking about Basquiat. There also is a video by FD Signifier talking about black cops and how they won't save us. It's like cops that are representative or supposedly a representative of any sort of marginalized community. That is not the answer because they are part of this system. They are not given their own humanity, which is why, like, what I went on this like huge rant about yesterday, being very upset about cops showing up at Pride Without Police. Is it surprising? No. But also, like, we have to be calling out this shit and how, like, these people are not viewed as people. They are viewed as just as dispensable as the rest of us, but the only reason why they feel protected is because they are themselves protecting the system. They are part of the system. And once people get out of line or there needs to be a fall person, like, tokens get spent. And like how there can be internalized biases, like how, like he was saying, like in that movie, there can be people who can be even more cruel to people who are considered part of the same population because of this need to feel like they are, that they are different somehow.
John Singleton and Jean-Michael Basquiat were aware that black
which
police
is why,
were
like,
not
women
the solution to
police,
racism, and
queer
this reflects in their art.
police,
It's not the individuals,
disabled
it's the system they
police,
serve.
and that's
The
not
systemic
as
racism in
likely
the U.S.'s policing system has gotten so
occur,
bad that
but,
even an
like,
organization like the UN has put up
these
reports that say the
are
American policing system
not
continues the U.S.'s
solutions.
legacy of slavery. And considering the fact that of the entire world, the United States imprisons its own citizens at a much higher rate than any other country, that the majority of prisoners are members of marginalized communities, and that more than 400,000 prisoners are people in pre-trial detention, meaning that they have not been convicted of any crimes, and that a significant amount of prisoners are imprisoned for non-violent offenses, that is not a far-fetched conclusion to draw. Keep in mind that while the police in the US may be the most obvious and the worst offenders of maintaining the status quo through racist violence, this is prevalent throughout Latin America as well, where indigenous people are frequently killed by the police, as well as the whole of Europe. In Poland, the police are allowed to shoot at migrants, many of whom are legitimate refugees, to prevent them from entering the country. In France, migrants, especially those from North Africa, are frequently killed by police in the streets or in custody. The most recent case of which was a 17-year-old Algerian Moroccan boy who was shot point blank for trying to escape from the police after he was pulled over. In fact, French police were deployed en masse in 2024 to quell protests in the French colony of New Caledonia because the French government wanted to change the New Caledonian constitution and introduce a bill that would reduce the representation of the indigenous inhabitants in their own land. 13 people, including children, would die, and over 2,000 people were arrested. In Germany, there are numerous cases of black or Arab men being jailed and mysteriously ending up dead in their jail cells, either from being burned alive while tied to a mattress, to attacked to the point of having broken numerous bones, all judged to be suicides so that no investigation occurs. Similarly to the police in France, the police in Germany are also exported abroad. It was recently announced that members of the German police are going to be sent to Gaza, not for the safety of the civilians that had just endured a genocide supported and funded by the German government,
was
but to
out
prevent
earlier
Hamas from
today,
regaining.
and it has just been like all over the place. Let's see. Let me do a recalibration real quick. Please hold. I gotta wait for the bus to go vote. Are you in the US? I don't think I know this. Also, if you aren't comfortable answering, you don't have to say. Is it showing dropped frames on your side? It is not. Okay. We'll see if that does anything. Let me know if that keeps happening. Thank you for bringing that to my attention. Currently talking about the pigs. And how they're all part of this system, like with landlords in the US. Okay. Yeah, how it's like this is the natural result of, or the intention of, marginalization. Might want to lower your bit rate, if nothing else. Let me pull that up. Oh, here we go. It still appears to be stuttering a bit. Okay, let's see this. Oh, now I'm seeing the dropped frames. Interesting. And that, weird how it's also delayed too, and even seeing the dropped frames. Does that seem to be doing any better on your end? Thank you for letting me know.
Control of the Gaza Strip. And while we're on the topic, I wanted to briefly mention that Israel broke the ceasefire and has returned to bombing Gaza. Reports are coming in that almost 1,000 civilians have been killed, although it is almost certainly more. Organize yourself in some way, educate yourself about what's been happening and what you can do about it. I recommend checking out the ODS initiative. I've been speaking with a few people from the group, and I'd recommend reading into it. Within Germany especially, the rate of police violence, especially during protests, has gotten so bad that human rights organizations have criticized the police in Berlin for their excessive use of violence against civilians. And while we're at it, let's talk about the function of the police in political repression. Now, some may
like
hear
a
political repression and think,
slideshow? Oh boy.
whoa, political repression in the West? That's impossible. We stand for liberty and freedom. I see this weird idea online that political repression is something that only happens in countries that America and the West coincidentally hates, like Russia, Iran, or China, and that America or other European countries don't repress political opponents, and that the status quo is maintained not by violent repression of any opposition, but because these countries just have freedom or some wholly democratic system that anyone who would even dare challenge the state would have to be some extremist. But this isn't anywhere near the truth. We've already talked about police repression of labor movements, and you've most likely heard about the violent repercussions and arbitrary arrests that fell upon black civil rights protesters who participated in nonviolent protests such as sit-ins, marches, and boycotts. But let us continue on this path of analysis and reach the only conclusion to be had on the function of the police. Where there has been resistance to the capitalist system, whether that be in the form of increased workers' rights, black civil rights, or women's rights, the police have moved to prevent them from reaching their goals. While women were protesting for their right to vote, they were often threatened and arrested while pushing for political change. In 1910, Britain, for example, after the Prime Minister had refused to consider a bill giving a small minority of women who owned property the right to vote, 300 suffragists tried to storm Parliament to force a conversation. The police responded, beating them in the streets, repeatedly sexually assaulting them, and arresting more than 100 of them.
I am wired to the router, but maybe I need to restart the router too, because our power was out today and everything's just been fucky ever since. Since adjusting that, has that made any difference? Let me keep playing this just
in 1917, a group of suffragettes were arrested for picketing in front of the White House, and while in jail, were beaten so severely that some suffered heart attacks and were tortured by methods including force feeding and chaining them in uncomfortable positions for a long period of time. During the civil rights protest and after, the U.S. has continuously harassed, arrested, and killed protesters. Martin Luther King and many other civil rights leaders have become a sort of liberal darling in today's culture, but it's important to realize that liberals and conservatives alike despised MLK during his life. MLK was arrested numerous times while being a part of the civil rights movement, all as a part of an attempt to get him to shut up. In 1956, he was jailed for driving 30 miles per hour on a 25-per-hour road. In 1958, he was arrested for loitering, and on numerous occasions, he was arrested for civil disobedience, the very same peaceful protests that Americans are taught was how black people won their civil rights. Except black Americans didn't just achieve civil rights via peaceful protests. There were other groups focused on the liberation of black people that took a more militant approach, a more internationalist one, that received even harsher treatment. A prime example of this was the murder of Black Panther leader Fred Hampton. After spending his short life organizing not only black civil rights groups like the Panthers, but also groups focused on poor white and Latino youth, organizing reading groups, and providing free breakfast to poor kids in Chicago.
Okay. I'm going to stop streaming for a sec to restart the router. There are moments where it's good. Okay, interesting. I'm going to be just like a minute or two, just waiting for it to reroute if you all are interested in picking back up again. If you have your notifications on, I think it should let you know when I'm back up again. Okay. Hopefully I see you on the other side where we have better tech happening. Okay, see ya. Okay. We did the whole resetting of the router situation. Welcome back to whoever is back. Let's see if this is any better. If not, maybe I'll just go on my hotspot. Hello, Bounce House. Welcome back. How is it so far? Let me know what is happening on all of your ends. Okay, I may play this as well just to see if this is doing okay, the more shit we have going on.
The police had decided that Hampton was a communist threat and that he needed to go. So after an FBI informed...
Honestly surprised it didn't make me refresh this. Hopefully that's a good sign? Question mark?
him, the police entered the house he was staying at in the early hours of the morning, killed and arrested other Panthers at the house, and then shot the 21-year-old Fred Hampton in the head twice at point-blank range while he was asleep. Similarly, in 1985, the headquarters of MOVE, a Christian anarchist black liberation group, was surrounded by 500 police officers to evict and arrest MOVE members. When the police started throwing tear gas into the building, members of MOVE began to shoot back, so the police responded by dropping a bomb on their apartment building, killing several people, including 5 children. The police then prevented the firefighters from stopping the fire for over an hour, resulting in the homes of 250 people completely burning down. Lethal force has also been used by the police and other state apparatuses in quelling protests against America's numerous wars. In 1970, after a group of anti-Vietnam War protesters at Kent State University had already suffered beatings and tear gas thrown in their face by the police, the National Guard was called in and ended up shooting 13 people, killing some that weren't even a part of the protest. Not even 2 weeks later, the police would come to Jackson State University and shoot 14 black students who had just been staging their own protest over the rumor that Charles Evers, a black rights activist, had just been killed. Following the death of George Floyd and the subsequent Black Lives Matter protest, police killed 2 protesters, one of them shot in the back and the other kneeling on the ground with his hands in the air. But political repression doesn't always have to mean outright murder. The amount of police brutality that had just occurred during the BLM protest is so numerous that an entire Wikipedia page has just been created documenting instances of police violence against protesters. Controlling protests and making people afraid to go onto the streets to meet up with other like-minded individuals is also a function of the police that aims to prevent the forming of larger political groups and movements.
Yes. So the fact that there were so many instances of violence happening, it was very real, intense retaliation against the state violence and the just completely unacceptable ways of enforcing this kind of violence, that it was being revealed that there was huge retaliation against that, especially when it came to people of color, but especially Black people during these protests. And, you know, that has not really let up a whole lot, but a lot of these things don't get covered in the news. Recently, I think it was just today, in the US, the Supreme Court ruled that it did not violate the law for cops to be shaving the dreadlocks off of a Rastafarian man. So, like, this type of racialized violence that continues, like, just can't be understated.
We can take the massive pro-Palestine protests of the last year and again look to Germany and the US, the two biggest financiers and supporters of the Israeli genocide.
Yeah, anytime the state is being called out for its violence, especially the industrial war complex, and how it upholds all of these systems of oppression. I mean, the state just is a system of oppression, but like all of these kinds of forces of dehumanization, the violence intensifies. Is this doing okay so far for you all?
That everyone watching this video has seen the videos coming out of the streets of Berlin or on university campuses across the US. When those videos come out, do you think other people who haven't yet been to protests are as enthusiastic about going? Or do you think they might change their mind about participating if they will get beaten up as well? To people in their 20s watching this who have been active in protests, how many times have you told an older loved one, like a parent or a grandparent, about experiencing violence at a protest or seeing some? And how many times has that person responded by saying, you should take care of yourself and stay at home, don't get mixed up in any trouble, or even, I'm sure the police had a reason to arrest or attack that person, they must have done something. It's exactly this kind of mentality that the police hope to create to prevent people from being active in their community. And it isn't all types of protests that the police try to break up either. The police are much more likely to use violence against left-wing protesters than right-wing protesters.
Yes.
And while this study pertains to the US, the same is
because
true
guess
in Europe
what?
as well.
Sometimes they
Germany,
even
example, the
are part of the organizational bodies of right-wing protests,
and use people saying this as a reason to break up a demo. Then
where
the police
they
started
can
raiding
get
homes of
like
activists and the offices of pro-Palestine
support
organizations.
from
Then the police started
police.
raiding private businesses because of their support for Palestine, confiscating the merchandise they sell as an attempt to financially hurt them into silence. All of this has culminated into the
This also, like as I have been saying in the past, just goes into this larger context of all of these types of organizational bodies or movements that people are trying to create that are grassroots, and how disorganized and dysfunctional a lot of it really is. But also how, like, there are many so-called leaders of these movements that are not willing to actually take on a substantial amount of personal risk, but still want to like be the face and have the fame and have like the recognition of being a leader, while not actually listening to what people need. And that there are some of these people that are saying like, hey, don't act in this way because then that reflects on us as leaders. And what it means to be a leader is to take responsibility for people's behavior, even if you don't agree with it. But especially if you are being a true leader, you should be listening to what everyone is saying. And you should be able to handle a certain amount of criticism and not just be defensive about it and get reactionary about it, which reveals this larger reactionary place that this is coming from, of like wanting to essentially like take advantage of these ills happening in society. Even if some people think they're going about it for the right reasons, it becomes very real once they are having more interactions with the state, when they have had so much privilege to begin with and not be brutalized or on the receiving end of state violence beforehand.
banning of Arabic at Palestine protests. Yes, a language spoken by upward of 1 million people in Germany, the language of the people who have just had to suffer a genocide, is illegal while at demonstrations. In addition to this, the police have also recently started pulling Palestinians off of the street, putting them into jail, and trying to deport them. All of this is justified in Germany's fight against alleged anti-Semitism. Meanwhile, Nazi and German nationalist demonstrations are allowed to roam the streets undisturbed. That saying on the banner, by the way, is part of a popular right-wing narrative of a double Holocaust that seeks to paint other things that happened during World War II as the same as the Holocaust carried out by Nazi Germany. In this instance, this flag is implying that the bombing of Dresden can be compared to the Holocaust. If that isn't a complete
oh my god. These fucking fragile ego cowards. Also, we have to call out when we're talking about this racialized violence, it's like racism, like race itself is a social construct, these constructs that are built through colonization and white supremacy, and how it is not an accident that it is very little talked about in history where there are Black immigrants that were some of the first to be targeted by the Third Reich and the Nazi regime, as well as Roma people and people who are disabled and queer people, that it's like, and communists that like, but to begin with, it started out with Black immigrants especially, and how this is just like a larger pattern and illustration of how when people are experiencing these hierarchies of human dignity that are created by these systems, they not only receive violence in the way of eviction and job prospects and over policing, but also with like quite literally like this very physical, I mean, not to say those forms aren't physical, but these overt forms of violence that happen, that it's like how these movements happen, it's not an accident, and it historically has a pattern
of genocide, then I don't know what is. I also want to bring up this brilliant piece of journalism from Deutsche Welle that describes how the police broke up a neo-Nazi demonstration in Leipzig by simply ending the demonstration. Some people were detained and searched, but not a single person was arrested. And at the bottom of the article, in just a throwaway line, the writer mentions another far-right demonstration that was almost twice as big happened in Bautzen, which of course it was in Bautzen, and that there were no arrests and no incidents. Just amazing journalism from the Germans. Police peacefully end a Nazi demonstration, while a second, much bigger Nazi demonstration goes on with no problems. Truly great, great work. And for further context, this black, white, and red flag is the Deutsche Reichsflagge, the flag used by the German Empire and today many prominent German Nazi groups. And it's the same in the US. Nazi and other far-right demonstrations
ugly
keep getting
behavior.
protection from the police, while other left-wing protesters
Cruel,
are beaten
disgusting
by them. And if you're thinking to
behavior.
yourself, well, maybe the police are like that because the Nazis are peaceful and the leftists can't follow the laws. For one, you're wrong, because being a Nazi is never a peaceful endeavor. And two, studies have shown that it is actually the police themselves and how they approach demonstrations that turn protests violent, which should be a no-brainer, because in no circumstance is surrounding a group of people who are already pissed off while wearing riot gear, carrying guns, having dogs, and using pepper spray and tear gas an attempt at keeping protests peaceful, especially while people are being beaten and arrested for things like speaking Arabic. In addition to attacking protests, the police may even start monitoring you before you ever get to a protest. Police officers across
speaking any language that isn't English, which the irony is about like speaking Spanish is that like Spanish is not the original language of many people, like where their ancestors would not be speaking Spanish, but they are because of colonization. So like just the irony there, but also how like race is a social construct. It's just because it's not European Spanish.
For years at a time as a way to get
also normally I would be showing my craft cam,
but
I don't want to
by undercover police officers. Among that
I don't want to
list is
tempt
22
fate
socialist and communist
with everything
groups,
going
9
on.
anti-racist groups, 9 anarchist groups, 10 environmental groups, 12 animal rights groups, 9 groups relating to Irish independence, a group opposing the Vietnam War, a group fighting against South African apartheid, a group against the arms trade, an anti-monarchist group, and numerous trade unions. I feel like I'm missing something. Oh yeah, and 16 campaigns against police misconduct. Compare all of that effort to the measly 3 far-right political groups that the police have infiltrated. It should go without saying, but the police overwhelmingly focus on left-wing political groups over right-wing groups, even though it is a consistent trend across Europe and the US that political violence against civilians is overwhelmingly committed by the far right. That's because the police's main goal isn't public safety or whatever people like to tell themselves, but the suppression of any internal threat to the status quo, which leftist, environmentalist, anti-racist groups, and trade unions are. Even more dangerous is when the police infiltrate groups and then use their own presence in the group as a justification for mass arrests. In the 2000s, a small group of people who had planned protests against the Republican National Convention while it was in the process of nominating George W. Bush was infiltrated. A group of 4 police officers joined the group, posing as carpenters, and began to attend meetings. During said meetings, the police officers repeatedly suggested that the protesters should use violence, destroy property, and resist arrest if they were approached by the police. Then, on the first day of the convention, the police met the group at a warehouse where they had been storing their protesting equipment and mass arrested them, before they even got the chance to do the protest, on the pretext of what their own officers said, implying that they were planning a violent riot. During the 70s anti-Vietnam War protests, officers acting as students began to burn things at protests, as an excuse to arrest all the protesters, including those who were trying to stop the fires. The treatment of protesters is even more brutal in the colonies of the US, like in Puerto Rico. In the 70s, the police encouraged a small group of activists to take control of a television tower for propaganda purposes. When the activists arrived, the police were there waiting for them and killed them all. Compare the treatment of left-wing groups to how the police, quote-unquote, infiltrate right-wing groups. In the 60s and 70s, the police infiltrated the Ku Klux Klan and became aware of numerous plans they had to attack the civil rights movement. FBI informant Gary Thomas Rowe, in collaboration with local police, took part in numerous far-right terrorist attacks under the guise of gaining the trust of the Klan. What the state deemed to be acceptable collateral for this task is the random murder of a black mother, the burning of buses occupied by the Freedom Riders, and taking part in the bombing of the 16th Street Baptist Church, an explosion that killed 4 little girls. Gary Thomas Rowe was given blanket immunity for any crimes he committed while undercover with the KKK in service of the local police departments. This trend stretches to today.
Yep.
Even with the overfocus on left-wing political groups compared to right-wing ones, the little effort put into
continuing the rage song, some of those
in Germany,
that work
the police had been
forces
tracking members
are
of
the
a
ones
neo-Nazi
who burn
network called the National
crosses.
Socialist Underground, and even went as far as supplying them with weapons. That group went on to murder numerous people across Germany before 2 of the main perpetrators.
This is a pattern of oppressors to be arming these so-called like terrorist groups who they deem to be terrorists, which really is just like anyone who is against this state-sanctioned violence wherever it is, but especially when it is colonial violence like what is happening with Israel, how they regularly arm Hamas. And hi Tiny, come here. He decided to join us. I don't remember where I was going with that, but
themselves. Or we can talk about Tobias Atten, the spree killer who in 2020 went into numerous kiosks and bars and murdered 9 people with immigrant backgrounds. Tobias has a blog in which he wrote about his desire to exterminate entire groups of people off of the face of the earth, advertised this blog via graffiti in the streets of Hanau, and even sent emails to public prosecutor's office with his address and his
how people like this
because
are
he believed they were secretly trying to communicate with him. All of these red flags
don't
that
receive
clearly
nearly
Tobias
as
was a right-wing extremist, but nothing was done.
intensive
This last example I'm going to give
sentences,
the personal one
if at
because in
all.
December of 2024 I got a comment under my older video, Germany was never denazified, that said something along the lines of, make a video about what happened in Marburg. I bet you won't because he was a Muslim. And once I commented under that comment talking about the attack, he deleted his original comment. So I hope that idiot somehow gets to watch this part of the video. In December 20...
It also is not an accident that the Trump administration, they have defunded the Southern Poverty Law Center, which one of the biggest things that they do is that they investigate white power groups and neo-Nazi groups that they try to claim like, oh, they're giving these people money. No, you just don't want to be infiltrated, bitch, because you're all Klansmen. It's like, I have been saying, like, this is just, like, the Trump administration is, like, fascist, mask off, but I think we need to be calling it, like, this is Klanhood on. Like, they're out in public doing their stupid, violent antics, and that, like, we have to call it what it is. About to feed the cats. Oh, how are they doing? How about you? Doing all right, you know, just keeping on, I guess. Just figuring life out. Talking about the pigs and how we are just living in a police state. I mean, we all know this. I mean, many of us know this at least. But also how we are stymied in any sort of organizing, grassroots organizing, especially like across the working class, and setting aside differences and acknowledging that we need a diversity of tactics, that there are so many people who are libbed up that are like, no, we can't do anything that will upset police. But like how I recently went to a Pride event where it was Pride without police, but they showed up at the end as a show of force and intimidation and like walking through Pride and like going around in their squad cars and stuff of like, no amount of respectability politics, no amount of like doing things the quote unquote right way is going to stop them from not brutalizing people, because they just do that anyway. So like the people who think that like not like trying to go about things in like a very correct way that is viewed as correct by the state, that is a way to suppress more militant organization and also like things that actually move the needle that they don't have control over.
For a Saudi Arabian refugee named Taleb Jawed al-Abdu Mohsen drove his car into a packed Christmas market in the German city of Marburg, killing 6 people and injuring almost 300. Taleb al-Abdu Mohsen was a far-right anti-Muslim activist that was a vocal supporter of both the AfD and Israel. He posted about his views publicly. He explicitly threatened members of the government, saying they deserve death because they had a secret plan to Islamize Europe, and the German government was warned repeatedly, not only by its own citizens who submitted warnings about him planning something violent, but repeatedly by the Saudi Arabian monarchy itself. All of this information was ignored. One has to assume that al-Abdu Mohsen...
that's a common hallmark of neo-fascists, of saying like, we don't want to Islamize whatever place you are at or wherever you're at. This is a year ago. I was curious when this was made. I guess he said in
the idea
2025.
of attacking a German cultural
I could
event
have, like,
because
used
most
my
Germans would
brain.
instinctively assume he was an Islamist. And he was right. Germans staged an anti-Islam protest in Marburg shortly after,
Yeah,
despite
anytime
this being
someone
very
says
much the same
Islamist,
ideology
that
that led to the
also
attack in the
is
first place. Germany also intentionally ignores other right-wing groups, such as the Grey Wolves.
red
For those
flag.
unaware, the Grey Wolves is a far-right movement that is known for committing racially motivated hate crimes in the name of Turkish nationalism. The group was created essentially as an anti-communist group by Alparslan Turkish, a Turkish Nazi collaborator and former member of the Turkish government. Although the group is incredibly popular within Turkey, there are thousands of members within Germany, around 18,000 to be exact. The group has regularly attacked Kurdish people, Armenians, Jewish people, even other Turkish people who aren't as nationalist as them. And yet, through all the discussion of rising anti-Semitic hate crimes that the German state likes to throw at Palestinian activists, the Grey Wolves are rarely ever mentioned. Presumably because banning a very popular political group from one of your closest economic and political allies would be bad for Germany, and if you'll notice here in this picture, that is the president of Turkey doing the symbol of the Grey Wolves. The trend repeats itself in France. In February of 2025, a neo-Nazi group attacked a screening of a film at a Turkish cultural center put on by the communist youth group Young Struggle. They beat many of the attendants and ended up stabbing one of the members. Afterwards, they ran through the city yelling, "Paris is Nazi and Lyon is Nazi too." Now, while the police in France have no problem beating and arresting people protesting for better pensions or shooting children in the banlieues with rubber bullets, it seems like the same attitude is not carried over to far-right activity. Because this wasn't just any group of neo-Nazi friends who did it, but a very well-known neo-Nazi group called the Jeunesse Bouillon. And you can see some of the members here doing the Hitler salute and wearing shirts with the Nazi SS hidden into their logo. The idea that the police can afford to and is willing to send hundreds of officers to protests and to patrol lower-income neighborhoods, to infiltrate themselves into left-wing groups, but not watch over a well-known Nazi group whose members planned and carried out an attack and stabbing at a cultural center is not incompetence on the side of the police, it is willfully turning a blind eye. In the same video I mentioned earlier about German denazification, I went in depth on the Verfassungsschutz report for 2024 and mentioned that despite the fact that the overwhelming amount of terror attacks are carried out by the right wing, the report takes up more time focusing on left-wing groups and the activities of Muslims within Germany. In the UK and France as well, despite the police overwhelmingly focusing on left-wing political groups, the police state that left-wing groups do not have a recorded propensity for violence. And if all that wasn't disturbing enough, it gets worse. In a recent article posted by Red, a news organization that I highly suggest everyone checks out, another aspect of police infiltration is highlighted, that being the use of these undercover identities to elicit sex from other members of the political party. Police across Europe, from Spain to the UK, both male and female officers, infiltrate political groups and start sexual relationships with other members of said group in order to gain their trust. Some of the women tricked into these relationships have filed official complaints for things like sexual misconduct and torture while said officers were undercover. This undercover mission has gone so far that some of these officers have fathered children while under these false identities. And this isn't some one-off thing that some police departments do. This has been defended by the highest level of government, such as the Minister of
Because guess what? Pregnancy, childbirth, these are also forms of oppression, of patriarchy that are weaponized to keep people not as militant, to have people closer to death. The number one cause of death of pregnant people in the US, which I say and will continue to reiterate, is interpartner violence. It is not complications from pregnancy, although it is astronomically high compared to other nations that are like so-called developed nations, which is just a colonizer way of saying like the white West. But how it's like it reveals this larger violent system of patriarchy. Okay, we still have quite a bit left. I think we'll finish this tomorrow, just with getting started a little bit later and some of the technical difficulties. I did want to talk about this video, or watch this video that is about the history of IQ tests, that anybody who is throwing around this as like a genuine hallmark of intelligence, it's incredibly discriminatory. It is very racist, particularly against Black people, but also how we need to be having this larger conversation of disability being a socialized construct as well, how it is very classist, that when you have people who are exhibiting delusional like white supremacy behavior and like delusions of grandeur by like the capitalist class, that it breeds that kind of behavior, like quite literally, because they believe in like eugenics and like breeding intelligence and all of this bullshit, that like we have to constantly be talking about what it even means to be able-bodied, and how it is also a colonial structure of oppression, because in many indigenous traditions, people who do not, who now are considered disabled, are viewed as having sacred roles in society, of having wisdom and also having access to other kinds of knowledge that other people do not. So, like, that also is a direct result of these colonial violent systems. This is by Free Science
Hello and
365.
welcome to this new episode of Free Science 365. Let me start with a question. What's your IQ? Now, I don't want to put you on the spot, but today we're going to talk about this very thing, the IQ test. So, over the past few days, I've asked people what phrase or picture comes to your mind when you hear the word intelligent. Almost everybody responded with one of two replies, Einstein and the IQ of a person. Most people consider Einstein as the person with the highest IQ ever. Also, most people think the best way of measuring the intelligence or smartness of a person is the IQ test. So, what is an IQ test? IQ stands for intelligence quotient. It's a number that one gets after they have attempted an IQ test. Now,
this editing, it feels like very Daisy reality shows. This is from 4 years ago.
This is a science channel, and so I can safely assume that most people
or like Bollywood
have
films
a higher degree of curiosity than normal people. So it's very probable that you, my viewer, might have done a paper-based IQ test or an online one. Basically, the IQ test consists of a set number of questions which must be answered in a set time. For example, 35 questions in 25 minutes. The questions have a lot of patterns, numbers, symbols, and pictures. Your task is to find either the next logical formation, or analogies of pair, or a missing pattern in the middle of a series of patterns. The attempter has to find the correct answer from a bunch of options, usually between 4 to 6 options, but it can vary. Once you're done, your answers are evaluated. If you are a child, your mental age compared to your chronological age is calculated. For example, if a 12-year-old kid attempts the IQ test and scores a score equivalent to the average score of a 16-year-old, then his mental age would be 16 years, although his chronological age is just 12 years. So his IQ score would be mental age divided by chronological age times 100. So in this case, it's 16, the mental age, divided by 12, the chronological age. You multiply this number with 100, and that gives you a score of 130.
It's also just assuming that, like, old people are, like, that you, like, gain more intelligence and knowledge with age, and that's just not always the case. There are plenty of people who are not curious and intentionally ignorant, not even just talking about, like, these ways that the state ensures people's ignorance through lack of education and resources, but like people who do have access to this who are intentionally ignorant, they choose those.
Quadratic equations in mathematics, for example, while their classmates are still struggling with fractions and proportions. Now, if you're an adult, your IQ score bracket among people of your age is measured from a normalized distribution of IQ scores in your age group. 100 is considered to be the average IQ of an adult. So the number that you see in the middle of this bell curve is 100, and 50% of the population is considered to be below this score, and the rest 50% of the adults are above this score. So a score of, let's say, 133 for an adult will put you into the 98th percentile of the population. The term IQ has become an integral part of the popular culture in every modern community on Earth. But you might be surprised to know that the original IQ test was not created to check how smart a person is compared to the average person on the street. In fact, its purpose was the opposite. Yes, its purpose was to find how unsmart a school kid is compared to their peers.
Especially to
it all started in
white
France.
kids.
The year is 1882, and the French government made it mandatory for every child between the ages of 6 and 14 to attend school. For the first time, people came from all social classes and represented all economic
white kids.
In 1904, the French Ministry of Education asked psychologist Alfred Binet to devise a method that would determine which students did not learn from the regular classroom instruction. The idea was to identify the so-called slow learners so that they could be given extra help. As a result, in 1905, Binet, along with Theodore Simon, introduced a new test for measuring intelligence of school children. This test was called the Binet-Simon scale. The purpose of this scale of normal functioning...
If this person wasn't a Darwinistic shithead, I would say his glasses were cool.
Compare children's mental abilities relative to those of their normal peers. The scale consisted of 30 tasks of increasing difficulty. The score on the Binet-Simon scale revealed the child's mental age. So basically, there were two purposes of the Binet-Simon scale. First, measure the mental abilities of school children, not adults, school children. And second, measure the mental age of a child below their normal chronological age so that they could be given extra help to learn things they were supposed to learn. So naturally then, the question has to be asked, how did it all metamorphose into the IQ test of today that actually measures how smart
I would show
a
this
person
on
is instead
the
of how
camera,
unsmart
but
a
I'm
person
afraid
is?
of
Enters Stanford psychologist Lewis M.
fucking
Turner.
up the tech today.
Lewis M. Terman created the classic IQ test and marketed his product to the maximum that he could. Terman strongly believed that all children and adults should be tested on his IQ test. He took a teaching job at Stanford in 1910. Now, Stanford was not today's Stanford in 1910. Stanford was not as reputed back then. Interestingly enough, it was Terman who made Stanford more popular. How? Well, Terman translated into English the original intelligence test devised by Alfred Binet and Theodore Simon. Remember, the Binet-Simon scale had been developed to identify mentally below-average children in the French school system. Well, Terman very cleverly made a few changes to the original Binet-Simon scale. 3 of them are worth mentioning here. First, he added harder items to the original Binet-Simon scale so that he could market it to the school districts to identify gifted children. Second, he added even harder questions so that he could then market his product to companies claiming that they could identify gifted adults. Third, he named the test the Stanford Revision and Extension of Binet's Intelligence Scale, shortened to Stanford Binet Test, which it is now known as. The first version was published in 1916. It is still being used today, although many changes have been made, but it's still being used today. Now, after administering his IQ test to a good number of people, Terman discovered 2 things. First, girls scored higher than boys. Second, whites scored higher than blacks, Hispanics, and other minorities. Now, about the fact that girls were scoring better than boys, Terman took it as a problem in the test. But about the second finding, that the whites were scoring higher than blacks, Hispanics, and other communities, he didn't see it as a problem. To Terman, this was just a reality of his time. So, what did he do? What he did...
Yeah, it's inherently racist. And also the fact like this reveals more of like, it's not talking about the crossover and intersections of race and people who were socialized or viewed as female as well, but also like when you have people who are speaking multiple languages, when you have people who have more access to education and books and resources, that like this affects all of these scores, but how it's measuring a very certain type of knowledge with something, and that it's like that doesn't mean it's assessing overall intelligence whatsoever. It's a very niche kind of intelligence that is extremely colonized in nature, especially when we are thinking about like this idea, or not the idea, but the phenomenon of colonizers imposing a certain kind of like school learning, which is often like the written word, and how like, especially for people who come from oral traditions, this is not in like, that's just colonizer behavior, and it's done violently, like through boarding schools and residential schools and like the institution of slavery, that all of this, it cannot possibly measure people's intelligence when it is inherently violent and racist to begin with. Hello, Anarcho Taco. Multitasking at work. Nice. Welcome. How are you doing?
Was nothing short of alarming by today's standards. So what he did was he deleted the type of questions that girls were doing better on.
The proof
and
of
racism. That boys
yeah.
were doing better on. So in this way, he normalized the test. But about the whites versus other ethnicities?
What's the Einstein quote? Something like, if you judge a fish on its ability to climb a tree, you'll never... Yes, exactly. So it's like, even he understood that there are like various types of intelligence, and how like he was viewed as like the pinnacle of intelligence in the Western world, and like still often is. And like people are like, oh, he was like, he couldn't talk until like the age of 3, and how it's like that was viewed as like a bad thing, and it was only until after he was able to like prove his quote unquote worth that he was shown to be smart. That doesn't mean that he wasn't smart when he was being quiet. Maybe he was observing shit. Have we thought about that?
Did nothing, because he also believed that whites are smarter than blacks, Hispanics, and others. It was only in the late 1930s, after 1935, 36, 37, that Terman stopped publicly supporting his IQ test as a scientific, quote-unquote, proof of the racial supremacy of whites. Nobody knows why, but the most probable reason is that he saw the horrible consequences of his line of thinking in the Nazi Germany of Hitler. Anyways, the IQ test, conforming to the
knows why, but then it shows Hitler.
Of his time, became more famous after they were
talking about
US military
Darwinism,
around 1.5 million
fitness bullshit.
IQ test. This made the IQ test wildly popular among the general public because it was claimed that the IQ tests helped America win the war. Of course, with so many IQ tests administered in schools and military and private companies, Terman became a very wealthy man. Now, this is what happens when you change a social norm, i.e. Binet's method to identify and help slower children in the French public school system, to a market norm, i.e. using the same Binet's method and selling it to schools and corporates for a profit.
Even that concept of, I wanted to develop this to help below average students, which is just assuming it's like everything has to be ranked. within Western colonial violent systems, that it's like we can't just be like, oh, there are humans and people have different kinds of intelligence, that it's like that would assume that there's a sense of equality rather than actually being like, oh, there's some people who are smarter than others. That's like, I mean, whether you are choosing, what we can talk about, it's like if you have access to resources and you especially are part of like the ruling class and you choose to not access these resources and learn and be curious about the world, then that means like you are ignorant and dumb in many ways. And so I shouldn't even say dumb. That has ableist associations with it, of like people who are not able to speak. So like all of our language is incredibly ableist. This is something I'm wanting to be better at, like catching things while I'm saying it. And it's like most of what we are saying, especially when it comes to like insults, it's based in very discriminatory language. And so I'm trying to practice the creative endeavor of finding my own ways of describing people in when they are doing evil things to other people. Ugly, not in terms of like proximity to white supremacist Eurocentric beauty standards, but or being ableist, but ugly as in like gross behavior in how you treat other people. No child left behind, as long as we redefine behind exactly. Constantly moving goalposts, and that's the intention, for it to be just completely arbitrary.
If you want to know more about Cobra effects, you can watch here. Anyways, coming back to Thurman, he imagined America as a truly meritocratic society where IQ tests
sparkly U.S.
In his ideal world, a higher IQ person would run a big corporation and a lower IQ person would do menial tasks. But doesn't that remind you of the plotline of books like Brave New World by Aldous Huxley? Anyways, so Thurman wanted to prove to the world that the gifted children with very high scores on his IQ test were indeed going to be great successes in their lives. In 1921, he started a study on gifted children.
Whatever that means.
He called it the genetic studies of genius.
Usually kids who are gifted come from a particular class as well.
Children, and he called it the genetic studies of genius. In 1928,
and have proximity to whiteness.
More gifted children. So in total,
because you know what? It's distressing to experience marginalization and discrimination, that like kids have a hard time learning and actually like absorbing what's going on in the world when they are not constantly in survival mode. Like even then they're constantly absorbing things, but like if we're talking about traditional like schooling, which also is like a colonial enterprise of like, but just in general, when kids are not forced into fight or flight mode constantly, they're able to actually access more creativity, which is also why like these genocidal forces of like the Israeli state, they are so deeply threatened by the creativity of Palestinians, that there is like, and that's not only just the thing that they're threatened by, but like creativity is a form of like humanizing ourselves, and that it is in direct contrast to this violence that is being imposed on people, and that often people have to resort to even more creative processes out of necessity to even survive circumstances. And so then it just continues the cycle of like, oh, we're justifying the genocide and dehumanization. We have to erase all sense of like creativity and culture because it justifies your humanity, but then people have to continue this in order to feel like they're human. So it just continues. Idiotic is interesting epistemology. Idiot originally meant private citizen who didn't participate in politics. That's interesting. I do know as well, like as the word has been used over time, that it often has been used to villainize and demonize people with mental illness, of saying like, especially if people have any sort of like schizophrenic inclinations, or they experience any type of like visual, like audio types of hallucinations, that has been a way to and an excuse to demonize people, to lock them up especially. And when we think about all of the people who have been placed in these categories as being like mentally unwell and stuff, especially people who are like being called paranoid, that it's like, how often has it happened where there are like very real things happening to people, but they are just being called paranoid and like they're quote unquote crazy when they are actually calling out these systems that they're seeing of like, yes, we're being surveilled. The government is watching us. Like, yes, we are like being controlled by like the ruling class forces. That it's like, you know, this has been a technique that has been done to women, especially. And then as we're talking about intersections of marginalization of women of color and immigrant women as well, but like real concerns or like actually like advocating for like having emotional needs or wanting to be viewed as a human being and not property, that it's like, oh, you're hysterical. And the thing, and like historically what that means, hysteria comes from the Greek word like hyst, like HYST, which means uterus, that they're like, oh, the cure for this is to help women have children. That it's like, oh, you aren't as angry about the world when you are more oppressed. Interesting.
Observed 1,528 gifted children over the years, and the study has continued to this date. Most participants have passed away, but a few are still around, and so I suppose the study will go as long as the last person in the original cohort of 1,528 children is alive. Now,
what's the quote? Just because you're paranoid doesn't mean they're not after you. Hello.
Now, ideally,
and that there are some people that would do well with being a little more paranoid about what's going on in the world. Yeah, of like, how do we even define paranoia?
Subjects could get better jobs. He gave personal advice to these subjects. He helped some of them get into college.
And also, like, how we're talking about, you know, it's just the larger continuation of this conversation of ableism, of like, true paranoia and delusion is white supremacy, is being a colonizer, of feeling like there are enemies everywhere and that you have to act out in very violent ways. But because it is state sanctioned, that it is not viewed as any sort of mental illness, that there are class elements involved, that there's proximity to capital, these capitalists, and that with the blessing of the state, that it is viewed as acceptable and important and necessary.
To help them get admitted. These actions of Thurman compromise the integrity of his study. Despite all this, you would imagine that, okay, he didn't play fair, but perhaps he was at least able to demonstrate that high IQ children contributed to the society or were great successes in their lives. But despite all this, the majority of study participants' lives were very mundane and average. By the fourth volume of his Genetic Studies of Genius, Thurman had noted that as adults, his subjects pursued common occupations as humble as those of policeman, typist, and filing clerk. And he concluded, quote unquote, at any rate, we have seen that intellect and achievement are far from perfectly correlated. So even within his lifetime, Thurman had realized that his hypothesis that the gifted children would be great successes in their lives was wrong. Very soon, schools and employers began
the more he was like, this is right, like, while he was creating it. And then as time goes on, he was like, oh, I think I may be wrong. In the meantime, though, he made a shit ton of money off of this whole enterprise because there are these deeply colonized fascistic states that are wanting to expand their domination, their non-consensual domination, that they're like, oh yes, we'll pay you to speak here, to publish this, because we like what you're saying. It justifies these violent means that we are pursuing.
That IQ tests were not very effective in determining the future successes at schools and companies. In 1964, New York City decided to drop IQ testing in its schools. Soon, other schools decided the same. Also, in 1971, a Supreme Court decision banned IQ tests in most job hirings. So basically, the IQ score is not the real indicator of the true intelligence of a person. And more importantly, the IQ score of a person does not determine their future success. And that begs the question, what is real intelligence? How can we define intelligence in a better way? And can we measure the true intelligence of a person with a test? In our next episode, we'll discuss what we can define as true intelligence, or rather true intelligences. We'll also talk about how intelligence evolved, and more importantly, why it evolves in certain animals and creatures. I thank you for watching this video, and if you liked it, please press the like button. If you really liked it, please subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one. Until then, bye-bye.
Some great information. Okay. Moving along. So, as we are talking about these racialized, discriminatory, white supremacist, colonized systems that are inherently very violent, because marginalization is violence, that we have to constantly call into question as who is viewed as violent, who is viewed as unwell, mentally unwell, as like quote unquote fit, as being deserving of certain positions in society. This has to, I think, this lends itself, I should say, well to the text of Othello, how he is extremely racialized in this play, this Shakespeare play, and how we cannot separate this type of othering that he experiences and his need to feel justified in this position. How when people are in the ruling class, or even when people are viewed as being like part of the in crowd, that like when they are part of a marginalized population, it's never truly being accepted, and that this is an arbitrary thing that is imposed by these violent systems of non-consensual domination. An IQ number doesn't determine future success, but a postcode can. Yes, exactly. That's something like having worked for the state health department. There was a phrase that people would say that they also would not want us to like advertise, because I was part of media, and there was a reason why they wouldn't want us talking about this stuff, but I would like say it in interviews anyway. Which is maybe like one of the contributing factors of why they didn't want me there. Just like being subversive in the ways that I can, getting out information, like doing things in real time that they can't control and go through approval processes and shit. But that your zip code determines your health outcomes far more than your genetic code. Imagine that, because there are all of these oppressive systems, and that like you can have people like these maps that were created. The healthy, what is it called? Healthy Places Index is something that I helped do like some trainings on, like created some like educational information on how to like access this type of map where people can put in all of this information to look at policy and zip codes. And of course, guess what? Upper management did not like this. That the governor, who was like technically like one of my bosses, like way high up, Governor Caillou Cox, this just absolute shithead, that they did not want this information out, because then anybody could look up this information and see where there was historical redlining, that there, you can see the differences in income in like just across the street in different neighborhoods, and like the level of education that is available to people, or that like the highest level of education that they've achieved and that has been achieved or had access to, I should say, and that is determined by all of these other forces at play with these systems of oppression. So like, it can be depressing being like, oh, there are actually there are some people who are trying to do good things, or be like, we have access to data that people have a right to know. That was like one of my biggest things of being there and being like, how can I like be in the system? But I like am naive sometimes and was like, maybe I can change some things. But really, I think like one of the biggest things that like I'm proud of is like actually getting more data that is accessible out to people about populations that they were trying to suppress, this data suppression, and saying like, oh, you can't have these reports come out on all of these marginalized communities because they want to make it look like marginalized communities just naturally are that way, rather than addressing these systems of oppression that the state is perpetuating. So this is where it was very beneficial to have anarchist leanings and not always talk about some of the inner workings, or like go through all of these like bullshit processes that they're imposing on everyone, that like depending on people's buy-in to the system, they would often like comply beforehand, or what is that? Yeah, comply in advance, that's the term, where they'd be like, oh, I don't want to get in trouble, whatever that means, and so I want to like have this be approved by all of these like upper people. And I'm like, they don't care about what we do. They don't know about what we do. So why are you going to show them that shit when they're going to put the kibosh on that? Like, they aren't going to let us actually get away or let us do what we need to do if we're actually here for the right reasons and getting information to people. So you might as well like take things into your own hands, because what they don't know, and they don't care enough about us to actually care about what we're doing and understand what our jobs are about. So we can use that against them. And I think we all need to be doing this in our various types of employment. That's my take. Okay, I'm getting out my huge version of my Shakespeare anthology. I'm such a fucking nerd. Look at all of this. But also, like, having the privilege and opportunity of actually being able to go to a college where I could even have the chance to be nerdy about Shakespeare. Okay, so there is this video that I wanted to show about Othello. This is a very colonized perspective, and then we're going to get into more of the decolonization as we go along. This intro is pretty lengthy to Othello, so I don't think I'm gonna have time to read the full thing today, but we will be getting into it more tomorrow. I do think it is very important, especially as we are diving into like how we did for the Communist Manifesto, the Manifesto of the Communist Party, as well as like some of these more these denser texts that often are used like as a gateway and to be elitist and be like, oh, you have to have all of this type of knowledge in order to understand them. I don't think that's always the case, but I do think it helps to like actually take our power back and like use the type of like learning that I was exposed to, but you don't have to like pay tuition to get it. So like, not like I am claiming to be like this superior intellect or whatever the fuck that means, but actually have it be a little more accessible for everyone. And I think it's really helpful to have some of this context so that when we're reading the text, we can get into more of like the meat of it right away. But, you know, if there are any like questions and stuff as we go along, do ask, because I welcome questions. I think this is a good thing. We should all be asking more questions, like of ourselves, of other people, of the world we live in. So, at the risk of being cheesy, which I constantly am and fall into that, shall we start with this little intro?
Othello might be Shakespeare's...
Okay, this is Shakespeare play-by-play. I guess I should say that first. An introduction to Shakespeare's Othello's context, themes, and characters. This is the information you should know before you start the text, and not limited to this. I read theory. I love Clifford the Big Red Dog. Yeah, exactly. It's like, what are we actually viewing as, like we were saying, intelligence? And I think especially when it comes to these types of texts, or even like leftist thought in general, that there are many people that think like it's good to be like reading and educated, but I think that is one of like the pitfalls of organizing, is when there are people who think you have to have like it's good for us to be educated about certain things, but also like what does that even mean? Do people have access and free time to these resources to be reading all the time? That reading is a colonized concept as well. So like all of these things are at play here, and quite literally in the play. But also like you shouldn't have to feel like you are not quote unquote smart enough to engage with some of these texts. That's just a fallacy. And that often is supported by like these gatekeeping academic entities in order to justify paying a shit ton of money in order to have any sort of knowledge. Even Bluey is theory. Yeah, even like especially Bluey at times, where it's like, yeah, everything can be theory. And it's very reductive to be viewing people's intelligence just based on schooling, not only reductive, but also classist.
Tragic tragedy. In it, a strong and charismatic man, respected by everybody, marries a brave and virtuous woman, equally beloved by everybody. Their marriage happens against her father's wishes, but they overcome that obstacle only to run into a villain named Iago, one of the most interesting and influential characters in the history of English literature. It is a frustrating play to read or watch, but we're going to do it anyway. This is going to be a 7-video series that goes through this play act by act.
Okay, so he is an Iago dick sucker, okay? Not like there's anything wrong with sucking dicks. Love that. Cool. Amazing. But he is, I guess I should say, in just unnecessarily for Iago, and I think that is something that academics really love about Othello, and I think that is kind of a simplistic way of looking at the text, that like, yes, he's a manipulative person, but also like he talks so fucking much, and like we don't need to hear from him as much, which is why Toni Morrison's play Desdemona doesn't feature Iago at all. Like, she was like, I find him to be irritating, and I always thought that, and my professors would be annoyed at me sometimes when I would say that, because it's coming more from like this very classist, like racist, colonized perspective, essentially, of being like, no, he's the super villain, and it's like, no, he's just like acting in ways that like the system allows him to be acting. So anyway, the important aspect is what praxis is. Theory-informed action, then reflected on into the new theory. Yes, exactly. No need to read dead old white guys to participate. Yes. And I think that's why, like, there are some people on the left that can be, especially when it comes to, like, white leftists, that there's all this gatekeeping of, like, if you don't use certain phrases or terminology, like, that doesn't mean that like you can understand people's hearts and minds as like, again, maybe that sounds like cheesy, but I mean that in a sincere way. And I think there is not enough sincerity in the world that like you, like just because people aren't saying like what you view as to be like the quote unquote right thing doesn't mean that like you can actually assess what their capacity is to learn, and also like what their intentions are. Because like I've known people personally who are able to like say the right kinds of terminology, but they treat people like shit. So like, do you actually believe what you are reading? Just because you know how to talk about it doesn't mean you know how to act about it. So that's exactly what you're saying, anarcho taco.
Introduce you to some academic conversations that have been ongoing since the time that the play was first performed in 1603. This is a play that has been popular since that first performance and has maintained that popularity for over 400 years. My hope is that these videos will help unlock some of the themes of this play and give you the vocabulary to engage with the big ideas contained within it and help you perhaps find some wisdom in it. Maybe they will give you something clever to say in class or help you write a paper or whatever, maybe sound interesting at a dinner party. This first video is going to give you some background information and historical context and introduce you to some of the larger themes that will be discussed throughout the series. And if this sounds interesting to you, please consider subscribing to be notified when future videos and future seasons are published. And with that out of the way, let's start up this season on Othello. So Shakespeare drew inspiration for Othello from an Italian source. The characters and general outline come from a mid-16th century Italian novella by Giovanni Battista Giraldi. He was nicknamed Cinthio. It includes an unnamed Moor who marries a wealthy woman named Desdemona, and who works with a villainous ensign who inspires the Moor to jealousy with tragic consequences. All these pieces remain the same in Shakespeare's version, but as usual, Shakespeare adds complexity and nuance to the whole situation. The same Italian author, by the way, wrote the story that
even just calling him the Moor, I don't even know if I want to watch this. It's just talking about him in such racialized terms instead of saying like his name, Othello, talking about Othello, like as a character with thoughts and feelings, but it is constantly, or he is constantly referred to in racialized terms. Like even the full name of the play is, let's see, The Tragedy of Othello, the Moor of Venice. So it's like he was a marginalized person of what is considered of like not in the majority of the white race in Venice at the time. And so it also is like this idea of him being a Moor intentionally makes him racially ambiguous, which is a type of monolithization. Is that a word? There's probably some form of that. I'm gonna look this up. Making him into a monolith. Lithization? Nope. making him into a monolith of like all of these races, of saying like, oh, he's Arab, or he's black, or he is Daisy in some way, where it is just like, oh, he's a Moor, which is an extremely like racially charged word that would be used during Shakespeare's time to really just describe anyone who was viewed as non-white. Ugh, I don't know if I even want to watch this.
For measure, I've got videos about that one. The story of Shakespeare's Othello takes place in two distinct locations, Venice and Cyprus. Venice, for an early modern audience, is a very exciting place. It is a city with a reputation for commerce and multiculturalism. Within the city of Venice, people from Europe engage in trade with people from North Africa and the Ottoman Empire and everywhere else, really. It's a place where one could hear different languages being spoken and smell spices from all over the world. Because of its location and its position in an increasingly globalizing economy, Venice is always involved in tensions between Europe and the Ottoman Empire. It's a place that requires the presence of foreign merchants, but it also fears the influence of foreign militaries at disrupting that trade that Venice depends upon. It needs the presence of those born outside of Venice, but it's also cautious of people born from outside Venice. The other location, Cyprus, is interesting for other reasons. Venice ruled the island of Cyprus since the end of the 1400s, and early plotline in Othello will revolve around Venice needing to protect its position on that island and the Christian population within Cyprus from the Turkish Ottoman Empire. In order to do this, the Duke of Venice will send Othello to protect the island. This will be outlined in Act 1. The reason I bring this up is because if we were seeing this play performed in 1603, we would all be very aware of the fact that Venice lost the island of Cyprus to the Ottomans during the Fourth Venetian War in the early 1570s. The Ottomans conquered the island and held it all the way until 1878. So the action of Shakespeare's play must take place sometime in the late 1560s, before the Ottomans drive Venice off the island of Cyprus. So for Shakespeare's entire life, including the writing and performing of Othello, the Ottoman Empire already conquered Cyprus. Anyone watching Othello in the 17th century watches it knowing that Venice will not be successful in defending that island. That's subtext for the whole tragedy we witness on stage. We watch knowing that the tragedy of Othello is linked with, in the eyes of Christian Europe, the tragedy of Cyprus. The tragedy of Othello is primarily a domestic tragedy about a husband and wife, but there is a historical subtext that implies that domestic tragedies can have global consequences. Maybe Othello could have protected Cyprus had the events outlined in this play not ruined him. So that's the importance of the setting. I now want to turn to the importance of structure. The play's structure is influenced by the form of a medieval morality play, so it's worth time just to quickly explain what a medieval morality play is. It's a short play, often performed by ordinary people, built around a simple concept. A protagonist who represents a generic human, this character is sometimes even named something like Everyman, and this Everyman is surrounded by a bunch of characters who represent vices and virtues. The virtues try to help Everyman into heaven, while the vices try to tempt him towards sin. So there could be characters named Friendship or Charity, but also a character named Sloth or Lust. Everyone on stage fights for influence over the Everyman character's soul, and typically the Everyman is tempted, falls, and is then redeemed. That's a medieval morality play. Because Shakespeare's audience would recognize this narrative archetype, it might be interesting to point out some of the similarities here. It's very easy to read this play as a fight for Othello's soul. On one side, you have the angel, his wife, Desdemona, pulling him toward a supportive marriage, and on the other side, you have a devil, Iago, tempting him toward wrath and jealousy. There are virtues and vices competing for Othello's soul, and it should be noted that the character representing sin in these medieval morality plays would be charismatic and often talk to the audience directly, just as Iago will in this play. But of course, nothing is ever simple in Shakespeare. He will take those...
Yeah, which also there's this gendered aspect of women usually having like proximity to virtue, that they are expected to be virtuous.
That his audience has, and he'll subvert them or add nuance.
Whatever that means, which is really just like Christian ideas of
I'm going to publish one video per act. Each video is going to focus on a specific topic or theme Shakespeare explores throughout the play.
Supporting your husband
the first video
in
will focus on Act 1,
patriarchy.
and specifically the role storytelling plays, the way archetypes can be used to influence a reader's experience, those angels and devils, for example. That video on Act 1 will also focus on the ways characters try to tell their own stories. Some characters get to speak for themselves and control their own story, while others have stories told about them. The ability to tell and control one's own story allows a character to control the way that they are perceived in the world. Othello and Iago are both exceptional storytellers, and by
a
telling
concept
stories, they both
that
try to
is
bend reality
true
to fit
not
their
just in
individual
Shakespeare.
narratives. In Act 2, we're going to focus on reputations. Iago has a reputation for honesty, Othello for bravery.
If people can control their own stories, then what? Then the system can't control what is being told about people, which is why there is this, why ethnic cleansing is embarked upon, because it is to erase people's humanity.
Mona for virtue, and Cassio for being a big ol' flirt. Reputations impact the way these characters are treated, and reputations are also difficult to move on from, good or bad. In that video, we're going to talk about the importance of reputation within the play and the way the characters link their reputation on Earth to the fate of their soul in the afterlife. In Act 3, we're going to focus on how the play deals with vision and sight. Much will be made of the way the title character looks, and much will be made about the way certain actions appear to those who witness them. This play has an absurd amount of references to eyes looking and seeing. Sight is understood to be the best kind of proof within the logic of this play, so we're going to dig in and see what that's all about. In Act 4, we're going to focus on the role gender plays in Othello by looking specifically at masculinity and how the characters in this play understand manhood and the impact of those expectations on the individual characters. And in Act 5,
it being associated with violence,
some characters are permitted
primarily,
to speak and some aren't. In the final act of the play, some characters will become silent forever, either through their own choice or through their death, or both. And once we finish reading the entire play, I will produce one final video that will discuss the role of colorism and race through the entire play, and the perceptions and understandings of race in England during Shakespeare's life. So please subscribe to be notified when those videos are published, and for deep dives into other plays. Thank you for watching.
Okay, I guess it didn't end as egregious as what it started out as, but I don't know if I want to trust his opinion on race and colorism. I mean, as someone who is light-skinned, but also not completely white, of like experiencing a lot of racializing in my own experience. Like, I don't know. There's nuance there, but I would rather hear from other people on their views on race and colorism in Shakespeare than him. Because that's what we should be doing, in my mind. Like, actually hearing from people who are most affected by these systems, who, you know, have lived experience with what it is like. Okay, so, getting on my reading gloves, let's read the first little bit of this introduction to Othello in my Norton anthology. And once again, this is a form of classism and capitalism in academia, of having all of these books, these academic books, be so fucking expensive that I'm like, I'm gonna wear this shit out. I'm keeping this because I like Shakespeare, and I'm going to be using it and also disseminating the information. They say heaven is more human than human, but hell is abandonment. Wait, they say heaven is more human than human, but hell is abandonment and exile from humanity. Oh, yeah. Because, like, heaven, I love that. Heaven is this idea of what it means to, like, surpass human, human weakness. Hello, androgynous water. Welcome. Good to see you. We are starting to read the introduction of Othello. I don't know if that's your thing, but getting a little nerdy over here, as we do. How are you doing? Well, I really like that quote, Taco, of just saying that, like, yeah, hell is meaning, like, the absence of humanity. Very interesting. Hello, hello, welcome. Okay. So in my gigantic anthology, this is the introduction to Othello. Quote, "The problem of the 20th century is the problem of the color line," end quote. So prophesied the African-American intellectual and activist W.E.B. Du Bois in his classic study, The Souls of Black Folk, just as the century began, which I'm actually reading on my own. It's definitely in, like, the beginning of W.E.B. Du Bois's writing, where he was much more into, like, the idea of buying into the system, like the talented 10th, and feeling like as long as Black people in America specifically had education or access to education, that it would improve everyone's conditions, as opposed to looking at, like, the system itself as being inherently corrupt and oppressive. Du Bois's prediction may have been premature with respect to Shakespearean tragedy, where Hamlet, King Lear, and Macbeth continue to dominate critical attention throughout most of the 20th century. But today, I mean, I think especially Macbeth deals with race. This is a more reductive way of looking at race. It's like that one interview we were watching with Toni Morrison, where she's like, there are people who are considered white authors now that were not considered white at the time, like James Joyce, where they're constantly talking about race. Of, in Macbeth, like the Scottish Highlands, and how there are indigenous practices being quite literally demonized and at risk because of these, like, colonizing forces. But today, Othello speaks to readers and audiences alike with unusual power, largely because it explores race and racism in an unsettling fashion. Does this emphasis, centered on the dark skin of the title character, belatedly recognize a crucial issue previously neglected or misconstrued? Alternatively, does the recent preoccupation with race, see, this is why we have to keep a decolonizing lens with all of this shit. Does the recent preoccupation with race impose contemporary concerns on material with a different orientation? Thinking that there wasn't, like, racialized constructs even at the time of Shakespeare is, like, really weird. white isn't a race. It's got no shared history or culture. It's an exclusionary concept. Ask the Irish or Italian. Yeah, exactly. It's like, this is why race is a social construct, and constantly having a moving goalpost that is arbitrary and saying who is in the quote unquote in crowd and who is not, that then the forces and powers that be can then define who they are then stepping on to justify these systems of hierarchy. Yes to both questions. Okay. Wait, did I read that last one? Wait, yes, I did. Yes to both questions. Interpretation is always influenced by both past and present. Here, by the play itself, together with its theatrical and critical heritage, and by the current preoccupations of contemporary audiences and readers. Saying it's a current preoccupation is such an academic way of being like, oh, decolonization is a very modern lens. It's like, no, the lens of decolonization has existed since colonization has existed. Just because it hasn't been like accepted into like the white academic sphere doesn't mean that it doesn't exist. A complex work elicits different responses in different times or places. In Othello, to oversimplify, one issue, jealousy, was formerly more prominent, while another, race, has emerged or re-emerged only recently, or only more recently that white people have been actually paying attention to this concept of race. Because that has been very apparent and clear to people who are considered non-white throughout the ages when they encounter this play. Neither race nor jealousy is the play's sole concern. Othello provocatively investigates gender and sexuality. It is preoccupied with class conflict, morality, and metaphysics, and it sets its central domestic disaster against the international conflict between Venetians and Turks over the island of Cyprus, a religious, political, and military antagonism that subtly informs the characters' catastrophic personal relationships. This thematic range can be investigated by looking at Shakespeare's handling of his sources, at his unusual manipulation of dramatic genres, and hence of audience expectations, at the psychology of Iago and Othello, as well as their interaction, and finally at race itself. Much of Othello's plot, but little of its outlook, characterization, or language, derives from Giovan Battista Giraldi's Cinthio's Daily Hecatomithi. Whoa. 100 Tales. Okay. Sorry to the Italians out there. Third decade, seventh story, 1565. In Shakespeare's version, racial issues are more persistent. The play here, of what the original inspiration for this was that Italian play. The play here draws primarily on the 1600 translation of A Geographical History of Africa by Leo Africanus, a Moroccan Muslim who had been captured by Christian pirates and brought to Rome, where he converted to Catholicism. So it's like Othello and his race is constantly being reinterpreted as depending on people's racial prejudices, and also the problem of making him into a monolith is that he doesn't have as much of an identity. And this is why as well that this is a concept that people who are considered non-white will understand right from the beginning. The public world of Venetian Turkish affairs, absent from Cinthio, probably derives from Richard Knowles' general history of the Turks. Minor characters are given interesting twists. For instance, Emilia, the wife of Iago, the story's villain, is passive in Cinthio, but in Shakespeare speaks for the rights of women, stands by Desdemona, Othello's wife, and ultimately brings her own husband down, at the cost of her life. So there are spoilers in here. Just so you know, maybe I should have opened with that. Sorry. The introduction will spoil things in the play, but at least it is with the hope that we are understanding more of what it means in the play. So if you are not interested in learning the spoilers, you may want to wait till we start into the actual reading, which I will put in the notifications for when I go live. Okay. The changes to Iago and Othello are even more consequential. Unlike Daily Hecatometes, malefactor who is motivated by unrequited lust for Desdemona and anger that she has refused his advances, Shakespeare's Iago loathes Othello and is determined to destroy him. So this also lends itself to a very queer reading of it, of these internalized queerphobic structures that Iago is not only jealous of Othello and wants Othello, whether it's romantically, sexually. He also wants Desdemona in a more objective way, sexually. And how when there are people who have this self-hatred that they then want to bring about the doom of other people. His manipulative mastery is given greater scope, which I think is giving Iago too much credit, thereby enhancing a sense of his power as well as his fathomless viciousness. Similarly, by making Othello Desdemona's killer, Iago's job in Cinthio, and by having him publicly acknowledge his responsibility for the act, Shakespeare increases the character's guilt as well as his grandeur, the latter further enhanced by an elevation in social status from his previous position in the source. Thus, Othello, like Daily Hecatomethi, ties everything to the central murder. Okay, I'm going to read this next paragraph, and then I think we'll be done. Yeah. The manipulation of generic expectations in Othello produces multiple perspectives on the plot. Though familiar with the classical dramatic genres of comedy and tragedy, Shakespeare was also influenced by late medieval, early Renaissance morality plays, like what that introduction video was talking about, by Renaissance experimentation with hybrid forms. Hence, all of his plays are mixtures, which is why, one of the things that I think is more genius about Shakespeare is that he didn't feel compelled to abide by form really strictly. And it's ironic because, many, groundbreaking, artistic types of movements or works, that this gets minimized in academic, historian, context and discussion, that it is essentially to minimize these larger ideas of pushing back against these oppressive systems and what people should and shouldn't do to create good art, quote unquote good art. Hence, all of his plays are mixtures. The distinctiveness of Othello, however, lies not in the co-presence of comic and tragic elements, a common feature in Shakespearean drama, but in the work's daring experiments with shifting generic frameworks. Okay, I thought I skipped a line. Its opening act, probably Shakespeare's invention, employs a strategy of studied indirection. It is night in a city, Venice, we are later told. Plot and character are presented in nonspecific terms. Roderigo is irritated that Iago shouldst know of this, of such a matter concerning a him, an unnamed personage invoked only by pronouns. Pronouns, you say? What? They were using pronouns? Even back then? That's too woke. Oh no. Hard to believe this play inspired modern orthopedics. Did it? What? I didn't know that. Wait. Tell me about this. I'm excited to learn about this. Thank you for letting me know. An unnamed personage invoked only by pronouns until the snide reference to his moorship, which is racist. The play's first audiences might have connected this character with the titular figure, even though Othello himself does not appear on stage until Scene 2 and is not named until Scene 3. Iago tells Roderigo to call up her father, again without identifying her or her father. So this is both racist and sexist by having Othello not enter the namesake of the play until scene 3, and that like we don't even learn his name, but that also Desdemona is not named at all. No, I'm shit posting. Okay. It's like, what's going on? I'm not gonna pretend like I know everything about this play, so I definitely fell for that one. I mean, in my defense, you do tell me a lot about things that I don't already know about, so. Let's see. The two men provoke Brabantio, her father, in similar oblique fashion, only gradually revealing that Roderigo's "this" is a sexual relationship, and still later that it is a marriage. Their imprecision about "this" encourages the audience to wonder what kind of play they are watching. And this is especially Shakespearean, to have a dirty mind. So, like, the people who want to claim, like, these, like, classist people that are like, oh, it's, like, the height of class. It's like, okay, you're talking about class, but you do know that, like, Shakespeare was extremely dirty-minded and, like, had all of these sexual jokes and would often make fun of the ruling class by, like, speaking in slang of the working class that the ruling class would not understand. It turns out to be a romantic comedy. Okay. At least in this part. It's very much a tragedy. Iago and Roderigo's strategy is aimed at persuading Brabantio to nullify the union. They do get Brabantio's aid, but they do not get what they want. Against the cultural norms of Shakespeare's time and subsequent centuries, the play celebrates Othello's grandeur. Desdemona, at least in, like, Western culture, Western white culture specifically. Desdemona's assertive autonomy, she wooed him. Yeah, that the minimization of Shakespeare's women, I think, cannot be understated, especially when it comes to, like, portrayals in film, that he was not particularly, like, a huge feminist at the time, but he also, like, wrote women to have more autonomy and, like, minds, like, be thinking. And part of that might have to do with the fact that he was viewing himself as having a more similar experience, because in Shakespeare's time, men and young men, boys, were only allowed to act on stage, that women were not allowed to, and girls, that it was viewed as being indecent, as not virtuous. So it's like you had men kissing men on stage. It's hella queer. You had men, young boys, dressing up as women, especially when they are young men, so that they can have higher voices, and that they're, like, the more complex female characters in Shakespeare's plays, many people think are often inspired by, like, young men that were in Shakespeare's troupe. So, like, whether it was, like, a feminist lean or not, whether he actually viewed women as, like, being more, like, thinking human beings, Shakespeare wrote women to be more fully formed than many other people at the time, at least in the area that he was living, in the British Isles, that because he was viewing them as being more similar to men because of who he was writing for, including himself, because he would act in these plays sometimes. I looked up Latin origin of ortho prefix, meaning straight, upright, rectangular, regular, true, correct, proper. Oh, ortho. Interesting. Okay. Marriage between Moor and Venetian, old and young, black and white. The initial suppression of the names of the lovers rendered them as character types to which stylized attributes, however misleading, can be attached before their individuality emerges. The darkness and the urban setting point to romantic concerns. The villain's machinations fail. The opposition of the old father, a standard blocking figure in stage comedy, proves ineffectual. The Duke, the play's highest-ranking character, ratifies the marriage. It has all been so easy. Midway through the third scene, the story is over. At least the comedy aspect of it. And usually in Shakespeare's comedies, or especially at the time, what would categorize a comedy is that there would be like some funny things happening, but the hallmark of it was predominantly that it would end in a marriage. So like it doesn't always mean that it would end in a happy manner. Like, which play am I thinking of? As You Like It. As You Like It does not usually have this like super happy ending. Like it ends in a marriage, so it's a comedy, but the ending is kind of like makes you, if you're actually reading the text in the way that it's happening, in a more uneasy fashion. So like that doesn't always mean that like he viewed marriage as like being the end all be all, because especially Shakespeare being very queer himself, which is not highlighted in many portrayals, like even in this latest film Hamnet. I enjoyed the film Hamnet, but I think it minimized his queer identity a lot. There are like multiple sonnets that people know of him to have written about a young man that he was in love with, like the Shall I Compare Thee to a Summer's Day is inspired by a young man. That the term drag, this is kind of legend, it's not really confirmed, but many people think it comes from Shakespeare, and that in the margins of his manuscripts he would write drag to have a shorthand for dressed as girl. So like that's where that term comes from. Like Shakespeare is super, super queer. So like the fact that like me being at BYU for college, this very Mormon school, and not having access to these more like feminist, queer centric readings made it so that we had very shallow interpretations of what it meant. And like me being like a queer little nerd and like androgynous, like, you know, non-binary person, not out at the time, but also being like, what is this? Can I talk about this? I would be like nerdy and like go to my professor's office hours sometimes, because they would be like, we can't talk about this here, like queer theory and stuff. They're like, but if you want to talk about it during our office hours, and I'm like, can we talk about this? Can we talk about drag? And like being exposed to more like queer theory that way. But that goes to show like the suppression, that even though we didn't talk about queer theory, it didn't make me less queer or feminist. So it's just funny, the things they try to control. That's like, that doesn't mean that it's not happening, sweetheart. This is just what it means to be human. Shall I compare thee to a summer's day? Thou art hot. Yeah, exactly. Especially these days. Like, oh, you are making me inflamed. Oh, okay. I think I'm going to have to end things there today, but we will continue the introduction tomorrow. I think I'm going to give it a little more time than what I did today. We may have a little more focus on Othello for tomorrow. It's going to be more of a bookish day tomorrow, because we'll also be following up with The Bluest Eye. Actually, going ahead with this reading, where I need a reminder of where I even had this. We are reading from page, at least in this edition, in the chapter, here's the family, mother, father, Dick, and Jane. They live in the green and white house. They are very, because it's a run-on sentence, essentially, the name of the chapter. It goes from page 38 in this edition to page 44. So that doesn't seem like it's very long, but that really is just like how packed with meaning all of this art is. So I want to give it the time it deserves. We'll be talking more about Desdemona, the play that Toni Morrison wrote as well. So I think it will be, I'm trying to plan things strategically. I think it will be lending themselves very well to each of these things that we're reading. So anyway, my mind was all over the place here, but again, what is new? All right, that's going to be it for me today, but thank you for being here. It was wonderful being with you, chatting with you. Thank you for your patience with all of the technical difficulties, with the power being out earlier today for me, but seems like we were able to get up and running without as many incidents, so that's a win. We'll take it where we can. Okay. Thank you for being here. I hope you have a good rest of your day, evening, wherever you are, and I will see you soon. Okay, bye.